All right, so I think I'm gonna get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event with Professor Nina Hull. Hello, class. Thanks for joining us today. This talk is part of a class taught by the members of the Digital Civil Society Lab. So we have our students joining us today in addition to members of the public. So for those of you who are joining us just for this talk, welcome. I'm really glad all of you managed to come. My name is Ashley Lee, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab. And I'm by way of visual description, I'm sitting in my living room in front of a painting of trees. I have dark hair. I'm wearing purple and brown glasses. Before we begin, I'd like to kind of acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continued to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. So consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. So today's event is hosted by the Digital Civil Society Lab. And just to say a few words about what the lab does. So the Digital Civil Society Lab is a research initiative of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And the lab investigates the challenges and opportunities for civil society to thrive in the digital age, addressing issues of safe, equitable, and purposeful use of data. And we encourage students during the talk today, as well as other attendees, to submit your questions throughout the talk, and we'll make sure to get to them during the Q&A. One more thing, logistical stuff. This talk is being recorded and will be available for view on our website following the event. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Nina Hull. Today, Professor Hull will be talking to us about her book, Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Era, subtitled Think Global, Act Local. Professor Hull is an assistant professor in the International Relations Department at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Her research explores the role of transnational advocacy and international organizations in international relations. Her most recent book, which she's talking about today, Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Era, will be published with Oxford University Press in June of 2022, so June of this year. Her first book examined how United Nations humanitarian and development agencies adapted to climate change, and it's called Displacement, Development, and Climate Change: International Organizations Moving Beyond Their Mandates. Professor Hull previously worked as a lecturer at the Hertie School of Governance and received a DPhil in International Relations from the University of Oxford. She's the co-founder of a think tank, New Zealand Alternative, and she currently serves as a faculty affiliate at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University and a research associate at the Center for Strategic Studies, Victoria University of Wellington. So welcome, Nina. I will now turn it over to you.
Good morning. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Hello. It's great to meet you. To all of the class and public, it's a real delight to be speaking in this seminar series. I'm speaking from Wellington, New Zealand, where I'm currently based on sabbatical. And it's a real opportunity to speak with you and have this conversation because I've followed the work of the Digital Civil Society Lab for some time and the work of Lucy Bernholtz. And some of the questions that you're asking in this class, I think, are really pertinent to the questions that I ask in my book. I know for those students in the room that some of the learning goals that you're trying to engage with are things like understanding the work and remit of digital civil society organizations, which is very much part of my book, is trying to understand this new generation of NGOs and advocacy organizations that are digital natives, that are born in the digital era. And also part of the goal of this class, as I understand, is to understand how different geographic and social contexts shape the ways that civic activism takes place. And my work spans across multiple countries, from New Zealand to Hungary, from South Africa to Sweden. So this is a really exciting opportunity for me to share this work. I'm just going to share the screen. And as Ashley kindly noted, the book is coming out in June. And so you're getting a little bit of a preview, although some of the work that this book is based on is already in the public domain. And I should note that this started over 5 years ago now, this work, on the streets of Berlin with discussions around activism, where I was working and living in Berlin at the time, actually, where Johanna Mehr, who's another member of PAX, is also based at the Hertie School. And I was really interested in, had worked on the UN, and I started to realize that the UN, as many of you may be aware, is quite slow to change and shift, and started to think about some of the new organizations that are much faster and more adept at changing and perhaps dealing with global challenges. So I want to share with you what I've learned in these intervening 5 to 6 years since I started working on this book. And the driving theoretical question is really, to what extent is transnational advocacy changing in the digital era? And I stress that for the class today because I know you've been looking at lots of different examples across the world. And as an international relations scholar, my interest is in very much the global context, but also how groups collaborate or not across borders. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of literature suggesting in the last 20 years that the internet, that the digital era, was going to make it easier to have transnational advocacy, right? We had people writing in the 90s in particular, in the early days really of the internet, saying that electronic means have literally made it possible to ignore borders and to create the kinds of communities based on common values and objectives that were once almost the exclusive prerogative of nationalism. So now we have the internet. It's not just that you can share memes and you can share, Facebook videos or Twitter hashtags across border like Black Lives Matter, but actually the very concept of communities goes beyond national borders. And so you might be forming transnational civil societies. Others have made this argument. These are both IR scholars and have written in a very influential book, Activists Beyond Borders, that cheaper air travel and new electronic communication technologies speed information flows and simplify personal contact amongst activists. And I should note, both of these pieces of work were written in the 90s, before social media, before Facebook, right? They're already predicting that we're going to see increased flow of information, more connections amongst activists. And more recent literature has emphasized this too. Manuel Castells, movements can spread by contagion in a world networked by wireless internet. So we've leapt forward a few phases of the digital era, if you like, and marked by fast viral diffusion of images and ideas. This is much more the world we're living in now. So I'm setting this out because my book takes up this challenge. It says, okay, there's a whole lot out there that suggests we should be seeing maybe more transnational advocacy or faster connections between individuals, that maybe national borders aren't as relevant. And that's really what I want to investigate. And because there's been no scholarship in international relations, the discipline I would call home, examining how these forms of transnational advocacy are changing in the digital era. So I, in my book, look at one particular type of transnational advocacy and one particular type of organization. So the scope or generalizability of my work is limited to these organizations. I'm not trying to make claims about all advocacy in the world, and feel free in the Q&A to ask me questions and probe this further. But I look at a new, well, not so new anymore, but organizations that were established in the digital era. Move On was the first, and if we were in a classroom, I'd ask you to hold up your hand to ask how many of you are familiar with Move On. It was established in 1998. Actually by developers from Silicon Valley. with the idea that you could use email petitions to contact people, get them to sign petitions and hold on to their email addresses and ask people to sign future petitions. Now that may not seem that revolutionary, but the key point here is that you're trying to capture a membership based on email address and that you hold on to that for future campaigns. So once you've got a whole lot of people mobilized on one issue, you can then use it again in a future campaign. So it becomes your resource. And that's important to hold on to this idea of email contact addresses as a core resource and source of power for the organization. I'll come back to it. Move On became really influential during the Iraq War. And other scholars have written important books about the Move On effect. David Karpf, whose book is featured on the left, is a very influential book about how Move On shifted and shaped American political advocacy. And he looks at this new digital era of organizations and the tactics and practices they used. Similarly, in Australia, we saw the foundation of GetUp, which followed the same kind of activism of collecting people's emails, using them for campaigns, both to mobilize people online to sign petitions, but also offline. And similarly, we saw that in the UK with 38 Degrees, and there are over 20 organizations worldwide that follow a similar model. So these organizations spread from Israel to Hungary to New Zealand, you can see down at the bottom, South Africa. There's been attempts in Papua New Guinea, in Nigeria and Nepal to copy a similar model. And so digital advocacy organizations overall exist in over 19 countries, spanning 6 continents, and they claim, and this is from their own website, over 20 million supporters. 20 million people are signed up to be members or receive their emails, and 1 in 5 domestic voters, 15, sorry. Now, what I just skipped over is that there is a large scholarship on these organizations, and that's mostly come from political communication scholars, people like David Karpf, Ariadne Vroman, who's written on GetUp, Andy Chadwick, who's written on 38 Degrees, but most of them have focused on these organizations in their national context. In other words, how have they influenced and shaped the national, say, Move On in the US, GetUp in Australia, political context? There are a couple of exceptions, some of my previous scholarship being one, and Michael Vaughan's work as well, where there's been comparisons, but there's been very little asking, what are the transnational connections between these networks? And that's really what my book does. Because interestingly, while these organizations are all nationally focused and based, so Move On is focused in the US, GetUp in Australia, they have formed a transnational network. This transnational network is called Open, and it includes digital advocacy organizations from around the world, I should note, who all share progressive values, so there's similar ideology, and in addition, a similar model of activism. And I'm going to elaborate in more detail on that model of activism in my talk. And I got really interested as an IR scholar. IR scholars are very kind of curious about the ways that activists collaborate across borders and about the ways that networks operate. And to what effect? To what effect do these groups that are based around the world that use digital means to communicate and mobilize, to what effect are they changing and shaping campaigns and important international issues like climate, trade, and refugees, which is what I cover in the book. So I've spent the last 6 years interviewing a number of these activists. I'm actually present in this photo. I've attended almost a dozen summits, and these are summits that bring together activists from around the world for a week to discuss how to do digital activism, but also how to think about and collaborate on particular campaigns. And I've done over almost, I would say, around 200 interviews, as well as doing a number of looking at the primary, secondary literature on these campaigns and collecting data, which I'll present towards the end of my presentation on the organizations and what they campaign on. And I'm happy to elaborate on any of this in the Q&A. Now, one thing I want before we go too deep into the theory is to remind us that these are organizations that are digital natives, so very much within the framework of the course, Digital Civil Society. However, what's important to note is they're not just operating online. And I say that because I think it's often these debates around digital tactics or digital activism or digital civil society get caught up in a sort of slacktivism debate, as in, if you're doing something online, it's not proper activism because it's not high bar enough. It's not asking enough of the participants. And I think that that's a false divide. All of the organizations I study use digital tools to mobilize people online as well as offline. So that there isn't, I don't think, such a clear-cut divide between NGOs or civil society groups that are purely digital and just operate in the digital sphere and those which just operate in the sort of in real world sphere. I think that there's much more overlap, and the interesting questions for me are the intersection of how do you use digital tools to mobilize people offline. So these are just a couple of examples. One in my hometown where I am now in Wellington, where 1,000, which isn't huge in global terms, but in Wellington, a small city's terms, quite large, to mobilize against a trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement between the US and New Zealand. And around the same time, we were seeing large protests in Europe. And this is about 250,000 people protesting in Berlin against the EU, the Atlantic Trade and Intellectual Property Agreement, and the Canadian equivalent as well. So these are large protests that were partly people mobilized by these digital advocacy orgs. All right, so where does the book come in and how do I approach what is like quite a big question around transnational advocacy in these organizations? Well, I'm giving you, I'm going to speak to just 2 of the chapters, but obviously if you have questions, I'm happy to answer others. So this is the contents page of the book. So one of the first chapters and what I'll speak to today is about the power of digital advocacy organizations. And here my interest is in what is distinct about these digital advocacy organizations that I study from mainstream NGOs. So I do a comparison between the way they source power and their model of activism compared to groups like Oxfam, Greenpeace, Amnesty. And I'll speak that through in the first next portion of my presentation. I also look at the growth, how these groups spread globally and explain how that happened. I outline their campaigning model, what it is that makes them distinct based on a lot of my ethnographic data. I look at how they've formed a transnational network and what underpins the way that Open operates. Then I talk about their trends, and this is another section that I'll speak to in my talk today briefly. When do they actually collaborate and target international institutions? And I have a case study of how they collaborate around climate action. And then I point to some of the tensions in the model, and I'll also point to that in my talk. So the core argument, which I make in the book, and answering this bigger question of how has transnational advocacy changed in the digital era, I say there's 2 things that scholars should be aware of, and students like yourselves. Firstly, we're seeing new forms of advocacy in the digital era. And this is what I'll speak to first, this new form being the digital advocacy organization. And secondly, these organizations campaign a lot on transnational issues. So they're campaigning on issues like climate change or refugees or trade, but they do so in a very, very particular way. They continue to target the nation state. So they're not targeting international institutions. We're not seeing a disappearance, like some of the quotes at the beginning of my presentation suggested, of borders. Borders are still important. Digital advocacy organizations still see the state as the locus of power. So they're the 2 arguments I'm going to make. And I want to drive now a bit more into that first argument, where I'll spend most of my time, and I'll touch on the last point as well. So the power of digital advocacy organizations. One of the chapters of my books unpacks what is this new form of organization? What makes it distinct from other organizations like Greenpeace or Amnesty? And there are 4 key elements that I'm going to speak to. So I can see some chats, and it's really great they're coming through. I might actually just address one of them because I think it's important, which is Felix has asked me, aren't Greenpeace, Oxfam, and Amnesty digital advocacy groups by now? Yes, they are. Good point, Felix. Any NGO that uses digital tools could be seen as a digital advocacy organization, you could argue. But as I'm going to show you now, there's some real key distinctions between the different ways that advocacy organizations use the internet to mobilize people. And so the organizations I'm talking about have a very distinctive model. And come back to me, Felix, if I haven't answered your question enough by the end of this presentation. So what the groups I study do, which is quite unique, is that, first of all, they campaign during elections, and they campaign specifically for progressive candidates and or to unseat conservatives. So Move On, for instance, in the US, organized the Big Ideas primary debate in June 2019, which you might remember back to. This was between the main Democratic candidates in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election. And it was one of the first major debates between the candidates. Why is this important? It's important because most conventional NGOs like Greenpeace or Oxfam tend to stick out as to stay away from too much overt political campaigning. Their model is much more issues-based. So Oxfam will campaign on, poverty, Greenpeace on climate action, but they're not going to typically pick winners or losers, people that they would support or not in election campaigns, because they're trying to be a little bit more apolitical. These digital advocacy organizations, which I'm studying, are specifically engaged in elections because they see that as a way to gain power. And because they're progressive groups, they back progressive individuals. In Australia, Get Up has mobilized lots of volunteers to get up progressives to vote. And they also helped to unseat a former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And so you can see as well from this poster, Tony, abstinence is not a climate option, that they're really targeting particular individuals. There are another three important elements of this model, in addition to the fact that they engage in election campaign. And this gets to your point, Sneh Gupta, how do I operationalize digital new media advocacy? I'm looking at a particular snapshot. And to your question, these are three really important elements that I am looking for to describe this model. So one is that they do rapid response campaigning. So groups like Move On, Action Station New Zealand, Campact in Germany, 38 Degrees in the UK, they're all similar in that they're able to use digital tools to rapidly start new campaigns. What does that mean? It means that a new issue can break, like Russia invasion of Ukraine. The next day they can launch a campaign. Now that differs from NGOs like Oxfam or Greenpeace, which tend to be much slower to start campaigns because of their bureaucracy, and also because they have long-term commitment to particular causes. They're not going to just drop one campaign to start another one. So to give you a concrete example, Oxfam every year tends to release a report around Davos and around poverty, and it's committed to that. It's working on the report for a whole year. And it's going to keep campaigning around poverty because that has a long-term commitment to that cause. And this relates to a second element of the way that we think about advocacy, at least in international relations. And you may have different perspectives from different disciplines, so please feel free to jump in. In international relations, we tend to think of NGOs and advocacy groups as issue experts. So that's the scholarship Keck and Sikkink, Fenimore and Sikkink. These are groups that have some kind of expertise, say Greenpeace on climate change. They get access to the international negotiations because they're known as experts on climate change, and they can help with very technical matters around what the climate negotiations, what direction they should go in. The groups that I study are multi-issue generalists. They don't have issue expertise in-house. So while they might campaign on climate change, the ways they'll do that is to mobilize people rather than to say, this is the specific technical solution or clause that you should have in a climate agreement. Their aim is mobilizing. And this takes me to the third element, which is that they're member-driven. They're not staff-driven. So a lot of the advocacy groups like Oxfam, Greenpeace, Amnesty have become increasingly professionalized. While they may have members, many of them do, they get funds from their members. Amnesty has letter writers. The staff choose the campaigns. So if we think of Amnesty, again, they're not going to ask their members, what is the worst human rights abuse this year that we should focus on? It's going to be staff who are experts in human rights, who go out into Syria or Burma and identify, here's a really pressing issue that we need to campaign on. Please help us with this campaign. And we look to those human rights experts to identify those key issues. In contrast, the organizations I study are member driven. So they would survey their members. They regularly do. They'd say, what is the top issue for you this week? What should we campaign on? And members might say, we're really concerned about the state of public libraries in the US, or the state of the health system, or we're concerned about climate change or LGBTI issues. And that will determine the campaigns they run. And what underpins this model, this rapid response, multi-issue, member-driven, is the fact that they operate online. They can quickly switch campaigns because they're online. Not only that, they can also survey their members really regularly. They can aggregate their preferences of their members rapidly, right? So the whole model is underpinned, they're digitally native. They can operate in this way precisely because they're online. And this allows them to generate what I call in the book, digitally networked power. And coming back to your question, Stan, Felix, about the different kinds of ways that we think about digital civil society online, I've written an article on this in International Studies Quarterly with two co-authors, Michael Dedman and Hans Schmitz, where we separate out the different ways NGOs use digital tools to do their advocacy. One way is digital broadcasting. So if you're Oxfam and you've got a report, you put it on Twitter, you put it on Facebook, and you say, I'm broadcasting. It's just like you would in the old days. Instead of putting it on the TV or putting it on radio or printing it, you're just using new media to share it. The groups that I'm interested in studying aren't just broadcasting. They're trying to create a source of power using digital tools. So what does that mean? They try to mobilize people, both online and offline, by asking them to sign petitions or to get out in the streets and protest. So an example of this, this is an Austrian group, Aufstehen, which is part of my case study, which after the refugee crisis, or during the refugee crisis in 2015, asked people to sign to say, you are welcome here to the refugees in Austria. And they had over 3,000 people sign up. So they're trying to create a social movement, a support generally for refugees. And so what I'm arguing here is that there's a different mode of advocacy that operates, that NGOs established in the pre-digital era, before the internet was ubiquitous, are still using the internet. As you've pointed out, Greenpeace, Oxfam, they're using the internet, but they're using it in different ways. They're using it often to broadcast, sometimes to customize. They're not so much using it to mobilize, although there are some exceptions, and you can push me on this because what I've painted here is a clearer divide, and of course the reality can be messier. So to just give you a bit more of an example of the way that digital advocacy organizations shape public debate on international issues, because a key part of my book is arguing international relations scholars who are interested in issues like how do we solve global problems of refugee rights or trade politics or climate change. How do these organizations, which are often just seen as domestic actors, influence in those global spaces? Well, if we go back to 2015, in September 2015, I was living in Berlin at the time. There was, as you may recall, because it also affected the US, an increase in the number of refugees arriving into Europe. And these were coming from the Middle East, often across the Mediterranean, many of whom were drowning as they were trying to cross the border or cross the seas. Now, as the images of these asylum seekers, particularly Aylan Kurdi, a young toddler from Syria who died, washed up on the shores in Turkey, hit the news, people started to show their compassion, to show their solidarity towards refugees. And organizations like 38 Degrees in the UK could quickly respond to this growing public tide of compassion. So 38 Degrees actually had a meeting the day after this particular image of Aylan Kurdi, the young toddler, went into the tabloids in the UK. And they said refugees are welcome in Norwich. They said refugees are welcome in Bristol. They had a whole lot of local petitions which people signed up to, asking their local council to welcome more refugees. So here's an example of networked power, that they were mobilizing people across the UK to put pressure on local decision makers to accept more refugees. And thousands signed the petitions. This was part of a broader movement in the UK. They weren't the only actors, but they were able to quickly pivot. They weren't working on refugee campaigns, and then they could quickly start a campaign. That's the rapid response. They moved from one issue to another. And over time, in fact, the UK, which had a conservative government led by David Cameron at the time, agreed to accept more refugees. They were initially reluctant, but after a few days of public pressure mounting, they did agree. Meanwhile, in Australia, much further away from the so-called crisis, we also saw a similar type of dynamic occurring. And this was also mobilized by a digital advocacy organization along with refugee expert organizations. So Get Up mobilized people under the hashtag Light the Dark. People went out, held vigils, and demanded that the Australian government welcome more refugees. And again, it was a conservative government, which was initially reluctant to welcome more refugees. And thousands, hundreds of thousands of people attended these protests, which were organized within the space of a few days. So again, rapid response, using digital tools to mobilize people offline. And what did we see in the end? Again, this was part of a groundswell of public shift in public opinion. And after a few days, the Australian government also agreed to increase its refugee intake. And I should note, in both of these cases, these were quite limited emergency intakes. They weren't like sustained sort of refugee intakes. Now, this might sound all very good. So far, I might be selling you or kind of pitching an organization that sounds like, oh, it's really rapid response. It's really, really reactive. So what's some of the downside of this? Well, one of the interesting things that I note in my book is that because these organizations are so reactive, responsive to members, they will also drop issues when they lose member support. And this is what happened with 38 Degrees and their campaign around refugee rights. While they were really fast in that initial phase in September to campaign to get people to sign up and welcome refugees, after a few weeks, people's interest shifted. So when they surveyed them and said, what is the most important issue for you? What do you think we should campaign on? Instead of it being refugees, it was saving the bees. Now, there's obviously good reasons to save the bees, but the point I'm trying to make here is that they shifted because their members shifted. So when I went to visit them in 2016, and there were still real issues around refugee rights, particularly at Calais on the French side of the Channel, and there were some refugee expert organizations continuing to try and put pressure on the British government, particularly to welcome in child refugees, 38 Degrees had sort of dropped their campaigning on this issue. And when I asked their campaigners why, they said because the bees, saving the bees is seen as more important. Now, this points to a bit of a tension in the model, that they're driven by members. So they're rapid, they're reactive. And some of these organizations I study don't try to transform their members' preferences. They take their revealed preferences. If you want to sit and watch cat videos, that's what you do. If you want to save refugees one day, save bees the next, save the local library the day after, these organizations will react to that. So they run popular campaigns. They run campaigns that have a majority support from their members. And that makes it really hard to campaign for minority rights, because you might get small moments when a majority of people support a minority right campaign, but it's quite possible you can't sustain that over time. However, I also found in my research that there were moments and times where some of these organizations followed a slightly different logic, where they were aware that if they just followed members' interests, they might drop campaigns, or they might not end up campaigning on really important progressive issues that they should have been. And so some of these organizations, like Get Up in Australia, which sustained its refugee campaigns, tried to transform its members' preferences. So even when they said, oh, we're not really interested in refugees anymore, they said, wait a minute, is an important issue we should keep campaigning on. And so they sustained campaigns over time. How am I doing for time, Ashley? I have a few more points to make. Have I got another 5 minutes?
Yes, we still have time, so please.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So far I've painted the picture of this model of activism, of a digitally native organizations that have spread around the world, that are part of a network but campaign in a different way from established NGOs like Oxfam, Greenpeace, Amnesty. And I've argued that that gives them power, the way that they're member-driven and they mobilize people really rapidly. And I've pointed to some of the tensions in the model, and there are others. I just want to quickly give you a few headlines around the patterns of transnational advocacy, because so far I've been talking very much on the form. Now I want to talk about what that means at a transnational level. And in the book, I asked 2 questions. 1, do they campaign on transnational issues? Does the fact that they're member-driven mean they just campaign more on local issues? And do they target international institutions? Who are the decision makers they're asking for change? So I'm going to just give you some stats on this, and we can come back in Q&A if there's any questions. I did collect data over a 1-year period of all the campaign actions for organizations in my case studies took. And so I looked at 38 Degrees in the UK, Get Up in Australia, Campact in Germany, Action Station New Zealand. And what this shows you, it's a sample of 1 year's worth of campaigns, that in almost half of the cases, they were campaigning on some kind of issue that went beyond borders, a transnational issue like climate change. And just over half, 52.7, they were purely domestic issues like the health service. And then there's this kind of complicated case of Brexit, which obviously was very strong in the UK at the time, which is inherently quite domestic, but also tied up with the European Union, so very transnational, and that's why I've coded it separately. The key point to take away here is a large bulk of their campaigns do relate to issues that spill beyond the national border. So an example would be trade campaigns. This is Campact in Germany trying to stop Mercosur, which was a trade agreement between the EU and South American countries. Get Up on refugee rights, getting kids out of Nauru, which is a detention camp. And another one about in the UK about a museum dropping Shell as a sponsor because it's implicated in climate change. So they're campaigning on these transnational issues. But the second part that is really interesting is they're not targeting international institutions, which is what some scholars might think they would do. Rather, they tend to target domestic actors almost exclusively. So the fact that there's only those little bits of blue, there's only 3 cases in my sample where they've targeted an international target. One example is the CEO of YouTube, who 38 Degrees targeted on campaigns around pedophilia. Campact in Germany targeted the EU on one trade case, and they also did campaigns around the European election. But the big point here that I make is that these organizations are campaigning all the time on transnational issues, but they're really targeting an international institution. And this is because they see national decision makers as the locus of power. So the second main point of my presentation in my book is to say we do see new organizational forms, but interestingly, they continue to focus on what would be the traditional locus of power, which is the state. So transnational advocacy has resulted in the digital era in many campaigns which occur at the same time, on the same issue, but with a different target. And I'm just giving you a taster here, really, of one of the final chapters in the book, where I look at these new patterns of climate protests as an example of transnational advocacy in the digital era, which is very much occurring at the same time on the same issue, but instead of targeting all the UNFCCC or the World Trade Organization, these groups are targeting their own leaders, their own national decision makers or state decision makers. And that's the model when we think of Fridays for Future. All right, I'm going to wrap up here because I want to have lots of time for Q&A. And I want to just reiterate these 3 points I've made. First of all, digital advocacy organizations can be influential, as in they're shaping certain debates, like around refugee politics, that they're member-driven rapid response multi-issue. And that makes them very different from a lot of the conventional NGOs that we study in IR, which tend to sustain campaigns based on expertise and staff-driven. These groups rely on member support to campaign. Digital advocacy organizations, they're constantly surveying and testing campaigns with their members, which means there's a bit of a dilemma for them. Do they just react to members' preferences, or can they shape them? And thirdly, they target national decision makers. Even though they're globally networked and they share campaigns amongst a transnational border, amongst a transnational network, they target national decision makers. And just to have a final note, I have focused on progressive groups, but I do, in a current piece of work, ask questions about whether groups on the right are emulating this model of digital advocacy organization that I've studied. And there's a few examples of research. All right, I'm going to actually hand over to you to moderate the questions, because I recognize there are already some in there, which is great. And I'm excited to hear from you all. And I'm happy to answer a few questions at once, if that's useful.
All right, thank you so much, Nina, for this really amazing talk. At this point, I want to invite everyone to post your questions in the chat, and we already have a few in the chat, so which I will read out to you, Nina. So the first question from Felix Hagemeister. I hope that I'm pronouncing that okay. Apologies if I mispronounced that. So might the logic of running popular campaigns, in your opinion, help political agents of a certain ideological family more than others? For example, are digital advocacy groups usually supporting more policies ideologically closer to left-wing or populist parties? For instance, Campact and Die Linke in Germany.
Great. I'm guessing, Felix, that you're German, given your knowledge of Campact and Die Linke. I think the broader question you're asking is a really interesting one, which is to say, if these groups are progressives, so they're operating on the left wing, which in the US is often called liberal, side of the spectrum, does that influence the kind of campaigns that they can run? And are these campaigns which are more the popular campaigns on the left? Yes is the short answer to that question. So what I'm saying is that if your membership, and I didn't talk much in my talk about this, that the membership of these organizations is broad. So they're not specifically just people interested in refugees or just the environment. The whole point is that they're a broad group of people from across the progressive circle. So you have to get a large majority of them to be on board with your campaigns, to take the actions, to give you funding. So you'll tend to do campaigns that you can get that majority support. So in the case of Campact in Germany, they did a lot of campaigns on trade, which was a very popular issue in 2014 and 2015. However, it dropped over time and people lost interest after the big protests that I put at the beginning around TTIP and CETA. And when they tried to campaign on EU-Japan or EU-Mercosur, they actually had much less interest and support. So they actually dropped their trade campaigning. It declined as a proportion of their overall. Meanwhile, climate campaigns have been very, very popular in Germany. In fact, Germany has one of the strongest student youth movements, certainly in Europe. Similarly, you could see a similar dynamic in say the UK or the US. What is interesting, and I just started to tease this out, is when these groups see their role not just in reacting to members' preferences, but trying to change the preferences they have. And this is what's happened in New Zealand, where Action Station has taken a leadership around Māori rights and decolonisation. And while there is a building progressive support for those sorts of campaigns, they've had to campaign on issues which have been quite controversial at times, like Māori wards, so having Māori representatives in local councils. And so they've had to almost go in advance of public opinion and trying to shape their members and even shape who signs up to the organisation, right? Because that's another factor, is who do you attract as a member and who might leave as a member, so that over time, even the people who are supporting your organisation changes. So yeah, in answer to your question, that is a finding. If you're interested more generally in these questions, Chantal Mouffe, Building a Left Populism, has written about these ideas more from a political theory approach about how do we think about left-wing populism versus the sort of right-wing populism of the Brexit and the Trump.
Great, thank you. So next question from Toussaint Notayes. In the process of writing and researching the book, did you come across cases of disagreements between these transnational advocacy organizations? You mentioned that the organizations are aligned in many ways, progressive, etc., but I wonder if you saw points of frictions. Also, did you see cases where topic object of the campaign was digital technologies themselves, right? So for instance, issues of digital policy such as net neutrality, etc.
Yeah, great question. So the network Open, which these organizations I study are part of, they're all united around their values, but they interpret progressive values different in different contexts, for sure. And what makes the network succeed is that there's only one organization per country. So Move On is the only US group, even though you've got Color of Change, you've got 350.org, you've got other American organizations that have started in the US and then champion this model, but only Move On as a member of the network. Now that's important because the network operates on a no competition basis. There's no competition between the organizations for members. And there's also a sense of respect that if you're the German organization Campact, you understand your context and you understand what progressive values are and what's possible if you're in New Zealand or if you're in the US. So while there might be differences in interpretation, say some organizations like Campact take trade politics really importantly, Move On didn't campaign so much on the trade agreements. So those differences do exist, but in terms of like deciding what to campaign on, the groups tend to just let everyone decide in their own national context what's most important. But I think underpinning that is also some differences about what they see the purpose of the network for. And I talk about this in one of the chapters. Is the purpose of coming together for those summits, like the image I had of everyone gathered around the open banner, to share best technical practices? Like how do you share a viral video? How do you curate a really good message so lots of people give you money? And those sorts of things are shared. Or is the purpose of it to do transnational campaigns on particular issues? So some people would say we should be trying to support more groups in the global south to copy this model. We should be putting our resources as a network into supporting global south groups. Some people say we should be trying to campaign on climate collectively, and some people say we should just use this to share best practices. So there are differences around how they interpret what their collective goal is as a network. On digital tech policy, there's been less collective activism. There are a few examples around hate speech. Campact in Germany has been involved, Action Station New Zealand, but it has been a bit of an undercurrent of the network of like, should they campaign on Facebook, given some of the ethical practices, Facebook, and the sort of digital surveillance, which I'm sure you've talked about, and privacy concerns. But I've seen fewer campaigns than one might expect.
I do wonder, as a follow-up to that, whether you saw digital surveillance and privacy issues coming up among these organizers as a point of concern for organizing on social media in any way.
Yeah, and there's very different, and I think this points to one of your learning objectives, very different contexts in different countries for what's appropriate. So in the US or the UK, I think you can gather essentially a lot of data on individuals. Like in the UK, I know they can, take somebody's postcode. So if you sign a petition and you put in your postcode, you can identify based on that, where you probably shop, whether you smoke or you don't, how many, coffees or beers you drink in a week. In Germany, data protection rules are very tight. And that means that if you sign a petition, you can't give that on to third parties. You may not even be able to use it in a subsequent campaign. So you can't get that kind of like micro-targeting and information. And it's just for historical reasons because of the history of the Stasi in Germany, East German police, you can't collect a lot of individual data in Germany. It's very, and you will have seen that and probably talked about it with new European norms around GDPR, that it's much stronger privacy regime in Europe than in other, say, more US Anglo contexts. So yeah, there is a really interesting difference across what these organizations can do and also where they're operating. So GDPR had a big impact on a lot of the particularly European countries.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from one of our students, Aditi Gaur. So her question is, how do you feel digital advocacy has transformed activism through protests? Do you see things like hacktivism and cyber attacks growing in popularity as a substitute for organizing in the streets? So this kind of getting at the online organizing and offline organizing dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the interesting question is how the internet has enabled people to mobilize offline as well as online. And rather than kind of, I understand your question, like, do we see an escalation of like hacktivism or cyber attacks instead of stuff on the streets? The organizations I study particularly aren't involved in activism. Taylor Owen has written a little bit more in this space around cyber and hacktivist type, Stefania Milan as well, if you wanted to read more in that space. So I haven't seen, what I have seen is that digital tools have been used to mobilize people really rapidly to also go out onto the streets, as well as doing, email style petitions or viral videos. And to me, the interesting question is, what are the organizational forms that underpin these different forms of activism?
Great. So next question is from Elise Colomer-Cheadle. She asks, so an organization like Global Citizen targeting the G7 or G20, does that qualify within this model of digital advocacy or not?
Yeah. So I'm less familiar with the work of Global Citizen. It's not one of the organizations that I've studied within within my research. So it would be great at least sometime to talk to you more about like what you see Global Citizen doing really, really effectively. There are a lot of organizations that operate, online that use, I can see that I just quickly checked their mission. We connect global citizens and artists to call on world leaders and corporate leaders and philanthropists to do their part. There's a lot of groups that are using the internet to try and mobilize across borders. And there are certainly learnings that you could take from this book. I guess what would be interesting to know is what is their theory of change? So what is their power base? What are they asking people to do in terms of the actions? And why are they choosing the G7 and G20? So in my model, or the organizations I study, all operate on the basis that their power comes from mobilizing members to put pressure on national decision makers. So if I move on in the US, I'm mobilizing Americans to say, stop the war in Iraq, and demanding the Bush administration to do that. If I'm in New Zealand, I'm saying, okay, we want to stop New Zealand support for the war in Iraq. We're going to mobilize New Zealand citizens to put pressure on the New Zealand government. And that's their theory of change. Now, I should say this is an analytical description. I'm not saying that other organizations don't have important roles to play, right? So this is an important point to make, that Amnesty, Oxfams of the world still do important international advocacy at international summits. And I'm not saying that that's going to disappear. I'm just saying that a lot of the scholarship, at least in international relations, has focused so much on that kind of targeting of international institutions that they've missed these other forms that are often seen as more domestic, but actually have transnational implications. So I'd welcome further conversation about Global Citizen, because there may be things I'm not aware of with their model.
All right, we have 4 minutes left. So I guess we could tackle this last question here. Do digital advocacy groups usually have membership requirements? So
So great question, Felix. In terms of how they conceive of their membership, it's easier to become a member of Campact or Move On than it is to become a member of Oxfam, generally speaking. You sign an email, and for some organizations, that's enough. You've just signed up to a petition, or you've signed up to receive an email. Many of them would distinguish between active members and just kind of followers. So if you're just getting emails, but you're not taking any action, if you're not regularly signing a petition or sharing something, you wouldn't be classified as a member. But what's important here is you don't have to pay fees. So in conventional NGOs, to sign up to be a member of Amnesty, you're a fee-paying member, right? That you're paying something. And so the membership bar is a lot lower in these organizations. I should also note, interestingly, they're mostly, the bulk of the membership is the baby boomer generation. So it's not necessarily the young. And one of the questions I pose in the conclusion is, how are they going to adapt to a younger generation who are operating more on Instagram or TikTok? And these groups have been built on email and Facebook. So there are some questions about longevity there.
Cool. And I would love to slip in one question and take moderator's privilege here. You mentioned multi-issue generalists versus single-issue experts, right? So how these digital advocacy networks are kind of empowering or enabling these multi-issue advocacy, more people who are more generalists. And I wondered if you kind of, versus like organizations that have been advocating for single issues for a very long time. So I wondered, like, if you saw opportunities or bases for kind of forming, kind of new kinds of cross coalitions, across different issues, because of digital advocacy opportunities. For instance, when you think about climate activism, for instance, and I study young people and their movements, we see a lot of kind of like efforts at intersectional organizing, across indigenous rights, climate activism, economic justice, that sort of thing. So I wondered if you kind of saw that among this older generation of activists that you studied.
Yeah, I'd be super interested to read some of your work, Ashley, and maybe we can continue, just because I have a separate piece that I'm working on climate activists in Europe and how the Black Lives Matter movement impacted their activism, asking questions really about intersectionality and about, did their goals, did their tactics shift? And we look at Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion in the 2020 period. So maybe, yeah, if you have some readings for me or some learnings, please share them, or if others on this call do. In the context of my book's research, what I find is that these groups, digital advocacy organizations, are quite often working in partnership with other domestic issue-specific organizations. So to give you an example of that, in climate protests, they will support the Student Youth Strikers or support 350.org, which is a single issue digital advocacy organization. And those groups which are doing the more sustained longer term campaigning, like Greenpeace, are actually really important allies for them, because they need other organizations who have that issue expertise and who are sustaining a campaign and ensuring that if a government makes a pledge, that it's actually implemented. And so you will see them form partnerships. But sometimes the organizations which are trying to be really rapid response don't want to invest the time in going to meetings and forming formal coalitions. And so the purest form of the model is so rapid response that you won't go along and be part of formal coalitions. And that's where there's some variation across the network, which I sort of allude to in the book. And I think the bigger question for you all sitting here today is sort of understanding there are different niches, right? Different organizations operate differently online. And that's just not using Facebook or not. It's about the organizational model. It's about the very theory of change that underpins it. And so to me, the big questions are like, how do we see different niches evolve? How do we see different organizational forms evolve in the digital era? What has that opened up? And that's what my book is trying to do, is sort of carve out one new form that is in addition to what other organizations are doing.
Fascinating. I know we could continue this conversation all day, but we've reached the end of our hour together. Thank you so much, Nina, for this really insightful conversation. I know that we didn't get to all of the questions in the chat, but if you wouldn't mind sharing your contact information on the chat or something so people can reach out to you. So there were some requests for readings, resources. That would be lovely. So yeah, so Nina's book, Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Era, will be out in June, and I'm really looking forward to getting a copy of that. So yeah, so that's the end of our hour together. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks so much. And if you are interested in further readings, I've just put in there the link to my website with research on the digital era, and you'll see one of the articles which I think will be most useful is the piece that I mentioned with Hans Schmitz and Michael Dedman on the different digital strategies NGOs use. And it was great to talk. Thanks for your excellent questions. I wish you all the best with your studies, and yeah, look forward to keeping a conversation with you all. Thanks so much again for hosting me.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks everyone.